On the night of September 15th, 1857, at Thornfield Plantation in Yazoo County, Mississippi, one of the most dramatic acts of resistance in American slavery history took place. A 34-year-old enslaved woman named Sarah set fire to the big house while her master, his wife, and the overseer slept inside, killing 3 people and liberating 200 enslaved souls in a single night of flames and fury. By dawn, the wealthiest plantation in the Mississippi Delta was reduced to ashes, and Sarah was leading a march of freedom toward the Ohio River that would forever change the balance of terror in the region. But this story of fire and liberation began 6 years earlier, when Sarah first arrived at Thornfield with hope in her heart and her daughter's hand in hers. It was April of 1851 when Sarah stepped off the auction block in Natchez, Mississippi, purchased for $1,200 by Master Cornelius Thornfield. She was 28 years old then, born free in New Orleans to a Creole mother and an unknown father, but kidnapped at age 23 and sold into slavery through forged papers that erased her entire identity. Sarah had spent 5 years on a sugar plantation in Louisiana, where she learned the cruel rhythm of bondage and watched her spirit slowly crushed under the weight of chains. But what kept her alive through those years was her daughter Grace, born in captivity when Sarah was 25. Grace was 7 years old when they arrived at Thornfield, a beautiful child with her mother's dark eyes and a smile that could light up the darkest slave quarters. Thornfield Plantation sprawled across 3,500 acres of the most fertile land in the Mississippi Delta, where cotton grew so thick and white it looked like snow covering the fields from horizon to horizon. Master Cornelius Thornfield owned 215 enslaved people, making him one of the largest slaveholders in Yazoo County. The plantation produced over 500 bales of cotton annually, each bale worth $100 in the booming cotton market of the 1850s. King Cotton ruled the South, and Cornelius Thornfield was one of its princes. The big house stood 3 stories tall, a gleaming white monument to wealth built on the backs of enslaved labor. 16 massive columns supported the front portico, and crystal chandeliers hung in every room, imported from France at tremendous expense. The house had 22 rooms, including a ballroom where the Thornfield family hosted elaborate parties for other plantation owners, where they danced and drank expensive bourbon, while 200 human beings slept in cramped quarters behind the cotton gin. The slave quarters consisted of 30 wooden cabins arranged in neat rows, each cabin housing 6 to 8 people in a single room with dirt floors and no windows. The contrast between the big house and the quarters was a daily reminder of the grotesque inequality that defined the institution of slavery. Master Cornelius Thornfield was 47 years old in 1851, a tall, broad-shouldered man with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He came from old Virginia money, his grandfather having made a fortune in tobacco before the family moved west to Mississippi in search of even greater wealth in cotton. Cornelius was educated at the College of William and Mary, where he studied classical literature and developed a taste for Greek philosophy, which he twisted into justifications for slavery. He could quote Aristotle on natural slavery while whipping a man until his back looked like raw meat. He wore fine tailored suits imported from London, rode a magnificent black stallion named Caesar, and carried a silver-handled walking stick that concealed a blade he was not afraid to use. But beneath his refined exterior, Cornelius Thornfield was a monster of calculated cruelty. He believed that enslaved people needed to be broken like horses, their spirits crushed until they had no will of their own. He implemented a system of terror on Thornfield Plantation that went beyond the usual horrors of slavery. Every Sunday after church services, which all enslaved people were required to attend, Cornelius would hold what he called instructional sessions, where he would select 1 or 2 individuals to be publicly punished for minor infractions, real or imagined. These punishments were designed not just to hurt the victim, but to terrorize everyone who watched. He kept detailed records in a leather-bound journal of every punishment administered, noting the number of lashes, the method used, and the resulting behavior changes. He saw himself as a scientist of subjugation, perfecting the art of breaking human souls. Cornelius had married Prudence Whitmore in 1835, uniting two wealthy plantation families in a strategic alliance that doubled their combined landholdings. Prudence Thornfield was 43 years old in 1851, a thin woman with sharp features and cold grey eyes that held no warmth or compassion. She came from Charleston society, where she had been raised to believe that enslaved people were property no different from livestock or furniture. But Prudence's cruelty had a different flavor than her husband's calculated brutality. She was petty, vindictive, and consumed by jealousy of any enslaved woman who showed even a trace of beauty or dignity. She took particular pleasure in tormenting house slaves, finding fault with everything they did and inventing reasons to punish them. Her favorite method was burning hands with hot flat irons for minor mistakes, like wrinkled linens or tea served at the wrong temperature. She kept a collection of different-sized flat irons specifically for this purpose, heating them in the fireplace until they glowed orange before pressing them against tender skin. The overseer at Thornfield Plantation was a man named Jeremiah Cobb, a 38-year-old poor white from Alabama who had worked his way up from nothing through sheer brutality and willingness to do things that made even hardened slaveholders uncomfortable. Jeremiah was short and stocky, with a perpetual sunburn that made his face look perpetually angry, small pig-like eyes, and hands like ham hocks that could break bones with casual ease. He had been hired by Cornelius 5 years earlier, specifically because of his reputation for keeping enslaved people in line through fear. Jeremiah lived in a small house between the big house and the quarters, positioned so he could watch everything that happened on the plantation. He carried a bullwhip coiled at his belt at all times, a weapon he had named Persuader, and used with terrifying skill. He could flick a fly off a horse's ear at 10 paces without touching the horse, and he practiced his whip work daily on wooden posts, imagining they were human backs. But Jeremiah's cruelty went beyond professional duty into something darker and more personal. He was a sexual predator who used his position of power to rape enslaved women with impunity, knowing they had no legal recourse, and that any resistance would be met with violence against them or their families. He had fathered at least 7 children among the enslaved population at Thornfield, children he treated no differently than any other property, working them in the fields as soon as they were old enough to pick cotton. He seemed to take particular pleasure in the suffering of others, smiling while he administered punishments, laughing at the tears of children separated from parents, making jokes about the scars he left on human flesh. Working under Jeremiah was a driver named Moses, an enslaved man in his mid-40s who had been elevated to a position of limited authority in exchange for betraying his own people. Moses carried a wooden paddle and was responsible for maintaining order in the fields, reporting any infractions to Jeremiah and sometimes administering punishments himself. He was a tragic figure, a man who had sold his soul for slightly better food rations and the privilege of not being whipped as often. Most of the enslaved community at Thornfield despised Moses as a traitor, but a few understood that he was simply another victim of a system designed to turn people against each other. When Sarah arrived at Thornfield with 7-year-old Grace, she was assigned to work as a field hand, picking cotton from sunup to sundown during the brutal Mississippi summers, where temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees. Each enslaved person was expected to pick at least 200 pounds of cotton per day, and anyone who fell short was whipped. Sarah's hands bled constantly during those first months, torn by the sharp cotton bolls and the relentless pace of work. But she endured because she had to, because Grace was depending on her, because she still held on to a fragile hope that somehow, someday, they might find freedom. Sarah was extraordinarily intelligent, with a quick mind that absorbed information like a sponge. Despite it being illegal to teach enslaved people to read or write in Mississippi, she had learned both in New Orleans before her kidnapping, and she had never forgotten. She kept this knowledge secret, understanding that literacy was dangerous for an enslaved person. But she used it to observe and understand the world around her in ways that her oppressors never suspected. She could read the newspapers that Cornelius left lying around, understanding the political debates about slavery that were tearing the nation apart. She could read the Bible that Prudence quoted selectively to justify oppression, finding the verses about liberation and justice that contradicted everything they claimed. She could read the ledgers that Jeremiah kept, understanding exactly how much profit her labor generated for the Thornfield family. But what made Sarah truly dangerous was her ability to watch, listen, and learn. She observed patterns in the routines of the big house, noticing when Cornelius took his evening bourbon at exactly 8 o'clock every night, when Prudence dismissed the house servants at 9:30, when Jeremiah made his final rounds of the quarters at 10. She noticed which doors in the big house squeaked, which floorboards creaked, where the spare keys were kept, how the locks worked. She memorized the layout of the entire plantation, every building, every path, every place where someone might hide or escape. She did this not with any specific plan in mind at first, but simply because understanding her environment gave her a sense of control in a situation where she had none. Sarah's daughter Grace was the light of her life, the reason she continued breathing when despair threatened to overwhelm her. Grace was a precocious child, curious and kind, with a natural empathy that made her beloved among the other enslaved children. She had inherited her mother's intelligence and quick wit, asking questions about everything, wanting to understand how the world worked. Sarah taught her daughter in secret, sharing what she knew about reading and numbers, whispering stories about their ancestors in Africa, about the Middle Passage, about resistance and rebellion, about people who had fought back against their oppressors. She taught Grace that they were human beings with dignity and worth, not the animals that Master Thornfield claimed them to be. She taught her daughter to be proud of who she was, even in chains. During those first years at Thornfield, Sarah made friends among the other enslaved people, particularly an elderly woman named Aunt Dinah, who had been at the plantation for over 40 years and had seen multiple generations born into bondage. Aunt Dinah was in her 70s, her body bent and broken by decades of labor, but her spirit remained unbroken. She was a practitioner of hoodoo, the African-American folk magic that blended African spiritual traditions with Christian imagery and Native American herb lore. Aunt Dinah knew the properties of every plant that grew in Mississippi, which ones could heal and which ones could kill. She served as the unofficial doctor for the enslaved community, treating injuries and illnesses with herbs and poultices when the white doctor refused to see them. She also served as a spiritual advisor, helping people maintain hope in the face of unimaginable suffering, conducting secret religious ceremonies in the woods late at night where they could worship without white supervision, where they could sing spirituals that were actually coded messages about resistance and escape. Aunt Dinah took a special interest in Sarah and Grace, sensing something different about them, recognizing the fire that still burned behind Sarah's carefully controlled exterior. She taught Sarah about the medicinal plants that grew wild around the plantation, showing her foxglove and oleander, and Jimson weed and water hemlock, explaining which parts were poisonous and how they affected the human body. She taught Sarah about dosages and symptoms, about how to prepare tinctures and powders, about how certain substances could be disguised in food or drink. She did this under the guise of teaching Sarah how to treat illnesses, but both women understood the darker applications of this knowledge. Aunt Dinah had lived long enough to see multiple rebellions and acts of resistance, and she knew that sometimes survival required terrible choices. Sarah also became close with a man named Solomon, a 36-year-old blacksmith who worked in the plantation's forge. Solomon was a massive man, over 6 feet tall with arms like tree trunks from years of pounding iron. He had been born at Thornfield, his mother and father both enslaved there before him, and he knew every inch of the plantation. Solomon was quiet and thoughtful, a man who spoke little but observed everything. He had a wife named Betty and 3 children, and he lived with the constant fear that they would be sold away from him, a fear that haunted every enslaved parent in the South. Solomon and Sarah developed a deep friendship based on mutual respect and shared understanding of their situation. They would talk late at night in the quarters, sharing their fears and hopes, discussing the news from the outside world that filtered through the slave grapevine, debating whether escape was possible and what freedom might look like. Life at Thornfield followed brutal rhythms dictated by the seasons and the cotton crop. During planting season in April and May, everyone worked from dawn to dusk, preparing the fields and sowing seed. During growing season in June and July, they cultivated and weeded, fighting the Mississippi heat and humidity while Jeremiah rode through the fields on horseback, his whip always ready. During picking season from August through November, they worked the longest hours, racing to bring in the cotton harvest before the first frost, picking until their fingers bled and their backs felt like they might break. During winter months, there was maintenance work, repairing buildings and equipment, clearing new land, processing cotton for shipping. There were no days off except Sundays, and even then they were required to attend church services where white preachers told them that slavery was God's will and that obedience was their Christian duty. But despite the horrors, the enslaved community at Thornfield created moments of beauty and humanity in the cracks of oppression. They gathered in the quarters at night to sing spirituals, songs like "Wade in the Water" and "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot" that carried coded messages about escape routes and the Underground Railroad. They told stories passed down through generations, tales of Anansi, the spider trickster from West Africa, stories of Br'er Rabbit outwitting more powerful animals, narratives of resistance disguised as children's fables. They celebrated births and mourned deaths. They fell in love and built families, even knowing those families could be destroyed at any moment by sale. They found joy in small things, a good meal shared, a song sung together, a child's laughter. They maintained their humanity in a system designed to strip it away. Sarah participated in these communal moments, but part of her remained always watchful, always observing, always cataloguing information that might someday prove useful. She noticed that Cornelius kept the plantation's financial records in a safe in his study, and she observed him, opening it enough times to memorize the combination. She noticed that Prudence had a weakness for laudanum, an opium-based medicine she took for headaches, and that this medicine made her drowsy and less observant. She noticed that Jeremiah got falling down drunk every Saturday night, stumbling back to his house well after midnight. She noticed that Moses the driver sometimes helped enslaved people in small ways when he thought no one was watching, suggesting that his betrayal might not run as deep as everyone assumed. She stored all of this information away, building a mental map of vulnerabilities and opportunities, not yet knowing what she would do with it, but certain that knowledge was power. For 6 years, Sarah endured. She watched her daughter grow from a child into a young woman, watched Grace struggle to maintain hope and dignity in impossible circumstances. She made it through each day by focusing on Grace, by remembering Aunt Dinah's teachings, by holding on to Solomon's friendship, by believing that somehow, someday, things would be different. She witnessed countless horrors during those 6 years. Saw people whipped until they couldn't stand, saw families torn apart on the auction block, saw women raped and men broken, saw children sold away from mothers who screamed until their voices gave out. She witnessed Cornelius's instructional sessions every Sunday, watched him whip people for the crime of existing, heard him justify each act of violence with twisted logic and biblical quotations. She witnessed Prudence burn the hands of a young woman named Chloe for serving coffee that was slightly too cool, watched the flesh blister and blacken while Prudence smiled. She witnessed Jeremiah rape a 16-year-old girl named Louisa in broad daylight, then whip her when she cried, claiming she was being disrespectful. And through it all, Sarah maintained her mask of obedience, never showing the rage that burned inside her like a furnace, never letting them see the fierce intelligence behind her eyes, never revealing that she was watching and learning and waiting. But that mask grew harder to maintain with each passing month, each new horror, each injustice. The fire inside her burned hotter, demanding release, demanding justice, demanding vengeance. The breaking point came on August 23rd, 1857. Grace was 13 years old, on the cusp of womanhood, still innocent despite the horrors she had witnessed, still believing in her mother's whispered promises that things would get better. That morning, Grace was working in the big house as a helper to the kitchen staff, learning skills that might eventually give her a position as a house slave rather than a field hand, a slight improvement in her circumstances that Sarah desperately wanted for her daughter. Prudence had been in a particularly foul mood that morning, angry about some perceived slight from a neighboring plantation owner's wife, taking out her frustration on everyone around her. She found fault with everything the house slaves did, screaming and threatening and looking for any excuse to inflict punishment. Grace was helping prepare the noon meal, carefully arranging food on serving platters under the supervision of the head cook, an older woman named Rose, who had worked in the big house for 20 years. Prudence swept into the kitchen without warning, her grey eyes scanning for imperfection. She walked directly to the table where Grace was working, examining the platters with an expression of disgust. She picked up a serving spoon, looked at it closely, then threw it across the room. "This is filthy!" Prudence hissed, though the spoon was perfectly clean. "You lazy, worthless creature. Did you think I wouldn't notice?" Grace's eyes went wide with fear. She had done nothing wrong, but she knew that facts didn't matter when Prudence was in this mood. "I'm sorry, mistress," she whispered, dropping her eyes to the floor in the expected posture of submission. "I cleaned everything carefully." "Don't you dare talk back to me," Prudence snapped, her voice rising to a shriek. She grabbed Grace by the arm, her fingers digging into the girl's flesh, hard enough to leave bruises. "You need to learn respect. You need to understand your place." Rose tried to intervene, stepping forward cautiously. "Mistress, please, the child meant no harm. She's a good worker. Be silent," Prudence screamed at Rose, "unless you want to join her in punishment." She dragged Grace toward the fireplace, where several flat irons were heating for pressing linens. Grace began to struggle, realizing what was about to happen, fear turning to panic. "Please, mistress, please," Grace begged, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't do anything wrong. Please don't." But Prudence was beyond reason, consumed by rage and the intoxicating power of being able to hurt someone without consequence. She grabbed Grace's right hand, forcing it palm down on the table. She took one of the glowing irons from the fire, the metal orange hot, and she pressed it against Grace's palm, holding it there while the girl screamed. The smell of burning flesh filled the kitchen. Grace's screams were primal, inhuman, the sound of a child in unimaginable agony. Rose cried out in horror. Other house slaves rushed in, drawn by the screams, but none dared intervene. Prudence held the iron in place for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 seconds, long enough to burn through skin and into deeper tissue, long enough to cause permanent damage. When Prudence finally pulled the iron away, Grace collapsed to the floor, cradling her ruined hand, sobbing uncontrollably. The palm was a blackened mess of charred flesh, already beginning to blister and swell. The injury would never fully heal. Grace would carry that scar for the rest of her life, her hand partially crippled, her ability to use it compromised forever. Prudence looked down at the sobbing girl with cold satisfaction. "Let that be a lesson," she said calmly, as if she had done nothing more significant than swat a fly. "Now clean up this mess and get back to work." She turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Grace writhing in agony on the floor. Rose and the other house slaves rushed to Grace's side, trying to comfort her, calling for Aunt Dinah, who had knowledge of treating burns. They carried the girl to the quarters. where Sarah was working in the fields, where Sarah would soon learn that her daughter had been permanently maimed for no reason at all except the sadistic pleasure of a white woman who could hurt with impunity. Sarah was picking cotton in the south field when Moses the driver came running, an expression of distress on his face that was unusual for his typically impassive demeanor. "Sarah," he called out, breaking protocol by addressing her directly rather than through commands. "You need to come. It's Grace. There's been an accident." The word accident sent ice through Sarah's veins because she knew there were no accidents at Thornfield, only deliberate acts of cruelty disguised as something else. She dropped her cotton sack and ran, ignoring the shouts of surprise from other workers, ignoring the rules that said she needed permission to leave the field, caring about nothing except reaching her daughter. She ran through the cotton fields, her feet pounding the dry earth, her heart hammering in her chest, fear and dread building with every step. When she burst into the quarters, she found Grace lying on a pallet, surrounded by Aunt Dinah and several other women who were trying to treat the burn. Grace was still crying, her body shaking with shock and pain, her right hand wrapped in cloth that was already soaked with blood and clear fluid seeping from the wound. The smell of burned flesh hung in the air, sickening and unmistakable. "Mama," Grace sobbed when she saw Sarah, and the word broke something fundamental in Sarah's soul. She fell to her knees beside her daughter, gathering the girl into her arms as carefully as possible, feeling Grace's body trembling against hers. "What happened?" Sarah demanded, her voice shaking with barely controlled emotion. "What did they do to her?" Aunt Dinah's face was grim. Mistress burned her with a flat iron, for no reason, just meanness. The old woman was applying a poultice to the burn, a mixture of herbs that would help prevent infection and ease the pain, but everyone in the room knew that the damage was permanent. Sarah felt something crack open inside her chest, felt the careful control she had maintained for 6 years begin to crumble. She looked at her daughter's ruined hand, at the blistered and blackened flesh, at the physical evidence of senseless cruelty, and she felt a transformation begin. The woman who had endured silently for 6 years, who had kept her head down and followed orders, who had maintained hope that things might get better, that woman died in that moment. Something else was born, something cold and implacable and absolutely committed to vengeance. "Mama, it hurts so much," Grace whispered, her voice small and broken. "Make it stop hurting." Sarah held her daughter closer, her own tears falling onto Grace's hair. "I know, baby, I know. Aunt Dinah is going to help. The pain will get better." But even as she spoke the comforting words, Sarah's mind was racing, cataloguing options, discarding impossible plans, forming the skeleton of something terrible and necessary. She stayed with Grace through the afternoon and into the evening, holding her daughter as the pain medication Aunt Dinah administered began to take effect. As Grace finally fell into an exhausted sleep, Solomon came to sit with them, his massive presence a silent show of support. Other members of the enslaved community stopped by, offering what comfort they could, their faces showing a mixture of sympathy and helpless rage. Everyone at Thornfield understood that Grace's injury was just the latest in an endless series of injustices, but it hit particularly hard because Grace was so young, so innocent, so beloved by everyone who knew her. As night fell and the quarters grew quiet, Sarah sat beside her sleeping daughter and felt the last remnants of her old self burn away. She had tried to protect Grace, tried to survive with dignity, tried to maintain hope, but hope was a luxury for people who had options. She had no options. The system was designed to keep her powerless, to allow people like Prudence to torture children without consequence, to enable people like Cornelius and Jeremiah to break human beings for profit and pleasure. The law would not protect her. God seemed not to hear her prayers. Escape was nearly impossible with 200 miles of hostile territory between Mississippi and freedom. She had only one choice left, only one form of power available to her. She would burn them all. The decision came with perfect clarity, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. She would not run, She would not beg. She would not appeal to a conscience that did not exist. She would become what they had forced her to become. She would meet their violence with overwhelming violence of her own. She would destroy everything they had built on the backs of enslaved people. And she would free every single person on this plantation or die trying. Aunt Dinah noticed the change immediately. The old woman had seen this transformation before, had witnessed the moment when a person moved from victim to warrior, from enslaved to revolutionary. She sat down beside Sarah in the darkness, her old bones creaking, and she spoke in a whisper so low that only Sarah could hear. "Child, I see it in your eyes," Aunt Dinah said. "I've seen that look before, you making a choice tonight." Sarah turned to look at the old woman, no longer hiding anything. "They took my daughter's hand, for nothing, just because they could." Her voice was flat, empty of everything except cold determination. "I can't live with this anymore. I won't." Aunt Dinah nodded slowly. "I understand. Lord knows I understand. But before you do what you're thinking of doing, you got to know there's no coming back. Once you start down that path, you can't turn around. You become what you do." "I'm already what they made me," Sarah replied. "A slave, property, less than human in their eyes. If I'm going to be damned anyway, I might as well be damned for fighting back." "This—" The old woman was silent for a long moment. Then she reached out and took Sarah's hand. "Then you listen to me careful. You remember what I taught you about the plants. You remember what kills, and how much, and how fast. You remember about timing and opportunity. And you remember this, most important of all, you ain't doing this just for revenge. You doing this for freedom. For all of us." Sarah felt something shift in her understanding. Aunt Dinah was right. This couldn't be just about vengeance, couldn't be just about punishing the people who had hurt Grace. It had to be bigger than that, had to mean something more. If she was going to damn herself, if she was going to become a killer, then it had to be for a purpose that transcended her personal pain. It had to be about liberation. How many people at Thornfield would run if they had the chance? Sarah asked quietly. "Most of them," Aunt Dinah replied, "near about all of them, but they scared. They don't know the way. They don't think they can make it." "What if someone showed them the way?" Sarah pressed. "What if someone made it possible?" Aunt Dinah's eyes gleamed in the darkness. "Then you'd have yourself a exodus, 200 souls marching to freedom. But child, that's dangerous. That's the kind of thing that gets everyone killed if it goes wrong." "It won't go wrong," Sarah said with absolute certainty. "I won't let it go wrong." Over the next 3 weeks, Sarah planned with a level of detail and precision that would have impressed military strategists. She went about her daily work in the cotton fields with perfect obedience, never showing any sign of the revolution she was planning, but every spare moment was devoted to preparation. She met with Solomon in secret, laying out her plan, convincing him to help. Solomon was initially horrified by what Sarah was proposing, but when he saw Grace's ruined hand, when he thought about his own children and the constant fear of their sale or abuse, he agreed. Together, they began recruiting carefully, identifying enslaved people they could trust absolutely, people who would rather die free than live in chains, people who were capable of keeping secrets and following orders. They chose 12 others, creating a core group of 14, including Sarah and Solomon, enough to accomplish what needed to be done, but small enough to maintain secrecy. Among the recruits were Rose the cook, who had witnessed Grace's torture and was consumed by guilt that she hadn't been able to stop it. There was Isaac, a field hand in his 20s, who was incredibly strong and completely fearless. There was Harriet, a woman who had been repeatedly raped by Jeremiah and wanted him dead with a passion that burned like the sun. There was Thomas, a carpenter who knew every building on the plantation and could tell them exactly how to burn Thornfield to the ground. They met in the woods late at night, far from the quarters, in a clearing that Aunt Dinah had used for decades for hoodoo ceremonies. Sarah laid out her plan in careful detail, and despite its audacity, despite its terrible risk, every person who heard it agreed to participate. The plan had 3 phases, each carefully timed and coordinated. Phase 1 would be the elimination of the leadership. Cornelius, Prudence, and Jeremiah all had to die, and their deaths had to happen simultaneously to prevent anyone from raising the alarm. Sarah would handle Cornelius using poison, Rose would handle Prudence in the big house, and Solomon with Isaac would handle Jeremiah at his house. Phase 2 would be the fire. Thomas had identified the weak points in the big house's structure, the places where fire would spread fastest and be impossible to control. They would use lamp oil and kerosene, substances that were readily available on the plantation and wouldn't seem suspicious. Multiple fires would be started simultaneously in different parts of the big house, creating a blaze so intense that nothing could survive it and no one could stop it. The fire would destroy the plantation's financial records, the evidence of ownership, the bills of sale that made slavery legal. It would destroy the symbol of oppression that loomed over the quarters. Phase 3 would be the exodus. While the big house burned, drawing the attention of neighboring plantations and the local militia, Sarah and her group would lead everyone who wanted to flee toward the Mississippi River, where they would steal boats and head north, using the network of safe houses and hiding spots that made up the Underground Railroad. Aunt Dinah had contacts throughout Mississippi and Tennessee, people who helped fugitive slaves, even at tremendous personal risk. The journey would be dangerous, and many might not survive, but anything was better than staying at Thornfield. Sarah knew they needed weapons, but guns were impossible to obtain, so they gathered what they could, agricultural tools that could serve as weapons in desperate circumstances. Solomon forged several large knives in the blacksmith shop, disguising them as broken tools that needed repair. They hid these weapons in various locations around the plantation, caches they could access quickly when the time came. The trickiest part of the plan was the poison. Sarah needed something that would kill Cornelius quickly and quietly, something that wouldn't be detected until it was too late. She turned to Aunt Dinah for guidance, and the old woman taught her about water hemlock, one of the most poisonous plants in North America. The roots of water hemlock contained cicotoxin, a substance so lethal that a piece the size of a walnut could kill a grown man within an hour. The symptoms would appear to be a seizure or stroke, nothing that would immediately suggest poisoning. Sarah collected water hemlock roots from the swampy areas near the plantation, carefully washing and preparing them in secret, drying them and grinding them into a fine powder that could be mixed into food or drink. She tested it first on a rat that Solomon captured, watching the animal suffer through violent convulsions before dying. The death was not pleasant, but it was certain, and that was what mattered. She calculated the dosage needed for a man of Cornelius's size, then doubled it to ensure success. They chose September 15th as the date for their revolution. That night was the harvest moon, which would provide light for their escape, but would also mean Cornelius was likely to stay up late drinking, a habit he indulged during the full moon. The timing was perfect, late enough in the picking season that the cotton harvest was nearly complete, but early enough that they could still travel before winter set in. Sarah spent the days before September 15th in a state of unnatural calm. She had accepted what she was about to do, accepted the moral weight of taking human lives, accepted that she might die in the attempt. She made her peace with it through a private ritual she conducted alone in the woods, where she called upon her ancestors, upon the spirits of every person who had died in slavery, upon the gods of Africa that her grandmother had told her about when she was a child. She asked for their strength and their forgiveness. She promised them that she would strike a blow for freedom that would echo through history. The night before the revolution, Sarah sat with Grace and told her daughter everything. Grace was terrified, but also proud of her mother, understanding that what was about to happen was bigger than just their personal suffering. Sarah made Grace promise to stay with Aunt Dinah during the actual uprising, to not participate in the violence, to be ready to run when the time came. Grace agreed, hugging her mother tightly, whispering, "I love you, Mama. No matter what happens, I love you." September 15th, 1857, dawned clear and hot, the kind of oppressive heat that made the cotton fields feel like an open-air oven. Sarah went through her normal routine, picking cotton with the same rhythm she had maintained for 6 years, giving no sign that this day would be different from any other. But inside, her mind was crystal clear, reviewing every step of the plan, checking and rechecking details, preparing for what was to come. As the sun began to set, painting the sky blood red and orange, Sarah felt a strange peace settle over her. She looked around at Thornfield Plantation, at the fields of cotton stretching to the horizon, at the big house gleaming white in the fading light, at the quarters where 200 people lived in bondage, and she thought, tonight, all of this ends. Tonight, we stop being victims. Tonight, we take back our humanity. The final preparations began at dusk. Rose positioned herself in the big house kitchen, ostensibly preparing the evening meal, but actually waiting for her moment. Solomon and Isaac gathered near Jeremiah's house, hidden in shadows, waiting for the overseer to return from his evening rounds. Sarah moved through the quarters, making final contact with each member of their group, giving quiet instructions, ensuring everyone knew their role. Aunt Dinah gathered the children together, including Grace, telling them stories to keep them occupied and safe. At exactly 8 o'clock, just as she had observed him do for 6 years, Cornelius Thornfield sat down in his study with his evening bourbon. He had spent the day reviewing plantation accounts and was in a good mood because cotton prices were high and this year's harvest was exceeding expectations. He had no idea that this would be the last bourbon he would ever drink, that the woman whose daughter he allowed to be tortured was about to serve him a very different kind of drink. Sarah entered the study carrying a silver tray with a fresh bottle of bourbon and a crystal glass, a task normally performed by male house servants, but one that Rose had arranged for Sarah to take over this evening by claiming the regular servant was ill. Cornelius barely glanced at her, seeing only a piece of property performing a function, not recognizing the intelligence and determination in her eyes. "Your bourbon, master," Sarah said in the soft, subservient voice she had perfected over the years. She poured the amber liquid into the glass, adding a small amount of water, as he preferred, and handed it to him. He took it without a word of thanks, returning his attention to the ledger on his desk. What Cornelius didn't see was the fine white powder Sarah had mixed into the water hemlock root powder that was now dissolving in his bourbon, tasteless and invisible, carrying death in every drop. Sarah stood quietly by the door, waiting to be dismissed as was expected, but actually watching. Cornelius took a long drink from his glass, savoring the bourbon, then another. He continued reviewing his accounts, occasionally sipping his drink, having no idea that with each swallow he was consuming poison. Sarah kept her face blank, her posture submissive, giving no sign of the cold fury that burned inside her or the satisfaction she felt watching him drink his own destruction. After about 15 minutes, Cornelius began to show the first signs that something was wrong. He put down his pen and pressed a hand to his stomach, his face contorting in discomfort. "Indigestion," he muttered, taking another drink of bourbon to settle his stomach, not knowing he was making it worse. Sarah remained silent, watching. The symptoms progressed quickly. Cornelius's face became flushed, then pale. He began to sweat profusely. He stood up from his desk, swaying slightly, confusion evident in his eyes. "Something's wrong," he said, more to himself than to Sarah. "I feel—" He never finished the sentence. His body suddenly went rigid, his back arching, his mouth opening in a silent scream as the first convulsion hit him. Cornelius fell to the floor, his body jerking and twitching violently, foam beginning to form at his mouth. His eyes were wide with terror and confusion, unable to understand what was happening to him. Sarah watched without expression as the man who had terrorized 200 people for decades thrashed on the floor of his study like a landed fish. She felt no pity, no remorse, only a cold satisfaction that justice was finally being served. The convulsions continued for several minutes, each one more violent than the last, Cornelius's body destroying itself from the inside as the cycutoxin attacked his nervous system. He tried to call for help, but all that came out was a gurgling moan, drool and foam mixing with blood where he had bitten through his tongue. His fingers clawed at the expensive carpet, leaving scratches in the fabric, his final act of impotent rage against a world that was killing him. Sarah knelt down beside the dying man and spoke clearly so he would understand her last words. "This is for Grace," she said. "This is for her hand that your wife burned. This is for every person you ever hurt. This is justice." Cornelius's eyes focused on her for just a moment, recognition and horror dawning in them as he realized that his slave, his property, the woman he probably couldn't even remember by name, was the one killing him. He tried to speak, tried to deny, tried to beg, but his body was no longer under his control. One final massive convulsion arched his back completely off the floor, his limbs rigid, and then he collapsed, utterly still. His eyes stared at the ceiling, seeing nothing, the light gone from them. Master Cornelius Thornfield was dead. Sarah stood up, looking down at the corpse without emotion. She felt no triumph, no joy, but also no guilt. She had done what needed to be done. She pulled out a cloth and carefully wiped down the bourbon bottle and glass, removing any trace that she had been the one to serve the drink. She left the study, closing the door behind her, moving on to the next phase of the plan. In the big house kitchen, Rose had been waiting for her signal. When Sarah appeared and gave a slight nod, Rose moved into action. Prudence Thornfield was in her bedroom on the second floor, preparing for bed. Completely unaware that her husband lay dead downstairs, Rose had spent 6 years as Prudence's personal maid, enduring countless acts of casual cruelty, maintaining a mask of servility while hatred festered in her heart. Tonight, that hatred would have its release. Rose climbed the stairs to the second floor, carrying a tray with Prudence's nightly cup of chamomile tea laced with extra laudanum to help her sleep. She knocked softly on the bedroom door, entering when Prudence called for her to come in. Prudence was sitting at her vanity, brushing her long grey hair, wearing an expensive silk nightgown. "About time," Prudence snapped, without looking at Rose. "You're slower than usual tonight. Put the tea on the table and help me with this brush." Rose set down the tray and moved behind Prudence, taking the silver hairbrush and beginning to brush the older woman's hair with long, gentle strokes. This was a nightly ritual they had performed for years, a strange intimacy between oppressor and oppressed. Prudence closed her eyes, relaxing into the familiar routine, never seeing Rose's eyes in the mirror, never noticing the transformation from slave to executioner. Rose continued brushing for several minutes, waiting for Prudence to drink her tea. Finally, Prudence reached for the cup and took several long sips, the laudanum-heavy tea working quickly to relax her. Her eyes grew heavy, her head nodding slightly. This was the moment Rose had been waiting for. Rose set down the brush and walked to the fireplace, where the flat irons sat, still hot from being used earlier to press Prudence's clothes for tomorrow. She selected the largest one, the same one Prudence had used on Grace, and she lifted it, feeling its weight, feeling the heat radiating from the metal. Prudence, half asleep from the laudanum, didn't notice anything wrong until Rose was standing directly behind her. "Mistress," Rose said quietly, and Prudence's eyes opened, confused, looking up at Rose in the mirror. "Do you remember a girl named Grace? Do you remember burning her hand 3 weeks ago?" Prudence's face showed first confusion, then irritation. "Of course not. I correct many slaves. I don't remember every—" She stopped mid-sentence as she saw what Rose was holding, as understanding dawned that she was in danger. Rose moved fast, grabbing Prudence by her hair and yanking her head back, exposing her face. Prudence tried to scream, but Rose clamped a hand over her mouth, muffling the sound. "This is for Grace," Rose said, her voice shaking with emotion. "This is for every child you hurt. This is for every woman you burned." Rose pressed the glowing flat iron against Prudence's face, holding it there while Prudence's muffled screams filled the room, while the smell of burning flesh rose in the air, while justice was delivered with the same merciless precision that Prudence had once employed. Rose held the iron against Prudence's cheek, then her forehead, then her other cheek, methodically burning the face that had shown no compassion for others, destroying the beauty that Prudence had been so proud of. Prudence thrashed and struggled, but Rose was younger and stronger and filled with righteous fury. When Rose finally pulled the iron away, Prudence's face was a ruin of blackened, blistered flesh. The older woman collapsed in her chair, whimpering, her hands moving toward her destroyed face, but afraid to touch it. The laudanum had her too sedated to fight effectively, and the shock of the burns was overwhelming her system. Rose wasn't finished. She picked up a pillow from the bed and pressed it over Prudence's burned face, pushing down hard, cutting off air. Prudence struggled weakly, her hands fluttering against Rose's arms, but she had no strength left. Rose held the pillow in place for 5 full minutes, long after Prudence had stopped moving, making absolutely certain she was dead. When Rose finally removed the pillow and looked at what she had done, she felt no horror, only a grim satisfaction. Prudence Thornfield would never hurt another child. Rose arranged the body to look like natural death, positioning Prudence in her bed, covering the burns with blankets, making it appear as if she had simply died in her sleep. It would be days before anyone examined the body closely enough to see the truth, and by then none of it would matter. Meanwhile, at Jeremiah Cobb's house, Solomon and Isaac waited in the darkness. They knew the overseer's routine, knew he would return from his evening rounds at approximately 9:30, drunk and careless. They heard him long before they saw him, his off-key singing carrying through the night as he stumbled home. Jeremiah was indeed drunk, a bottle of whiskey clutched in one hand, his whip coiled at his belt, completely unaware that death was waiting for him. Solomon and Isaac let Jeremiah reach his door, let him fumble with his keys, let him think he was safe. Then they moved, emerging from the shadows like avenging spirits. Solomon, huge and powerful, grabbed Jeremiah from behind, one massive arm wrapping around the overseer's throat, cutting off any cry for help. Isaac grabbed Jeremiah's arms, twisting them behind his back, rendering him helpless. Jeremiah's eyes bulged with shock and terror. He tried to fight, tried to break free, but he was no match for 2 strong men who had years of rage fueling their actions. Solomon dragged him away from the house, into the darkness, away from any possibility of witnesses. They took him to the edge of the plantation, to a grove of trees where no one would hear anything, where they could take their time. Solomon threw Jeremiah to the ground, and Isaac immediately began tying him to a tree, binding his wrists and ankles with rope they had prepared earlier. Jeremiah was screaming now, begging, promising them anything if they would let him go. "Please, please, I was just doing my job. I never wanted to hurt nobody. Please, I got money, I can pay you. I can help you escape. Please don't kill me." Solomon stood in front of the bound overseer, looking down at the man who had terrorized him and everyone he cared about for 5 years. He thought about his wife Betty, about the night Jeremiah had raped her while Solomon was forced to watch, beaten unconscious when he tried to intervene. He thought about the countless whippings, the casual cruelty, the children sold, the families destroyed. He thought about Harriet and the other women Jeremiah had raped, about the driver's sadistic pleasure in others' suffering. "You remember a woman named Betty?" Solomon asked quietly. "She's my wife. You raped her 4 years ago." Jeremiah's face went pale in the moonlight. I don't. That weren't. I was just..." Solomon backhanded him across the face, splitting his lip. "Don't lie, not now. You remember. You remember all of them, every woman you raped, every man you whipped, every child you hurt. You remember, and you enjoyed it." Isaac uncoiled Jeremiah's own whip from his belt, holding the weapon with grim satisfaction. "You like whipping people," Isaac said. "Let's see how you like it from the other end. 200 lashes, that's what we got planned for you, same as you gave to my brother Marcus before he died." Jeremiah began to sob, begging incoherently, promising impossible things, calling on God for mercy he had never shown to others. Solomon and Isaac ignored his pleas. They had not come for mercy, they had come for justice. Isaac drew back the whip and brought it down across Jeremiah's back with all his strength. The overseer screamed, his body arching against the ropes. Again the whip fell, and again and again. Solomon and Isaac took turns, counting each lash aloud, making sure Jeremiah heard the number. 10 lashes, 20, 50. Jeremiah's shirt was torn to shreds, his back a mass of bleeding welts. He was still screaming, but the screams were growing weaker. 100 lashes. Jeremiah had passed out from the pain, his body hanging limp in the ropes. But Solomon and Isaac didn't stop. They had promised 200, and they would deliver 200. They continued whipping the unconscious man, their arms burning from the effort, sweat pouring down their faces, but determined to see this through to the end. When they reached 200 lashes, Jeremiah's back was completely destroyed, skin hanging in strips, bone visible in places, blood soaking the ground beneath him. He was either dead or close to it. Solomon checked for a pulse and found none. Jeremiah Cobb, the terror of Thornfield Plantation, was dead, killed by the same tool he had used to terrorize others for years. Solomon and Isaac cut the body down and left it where it fell. Let someone find it. Let them understand what happens to overseers who brutalize enslaved people. Let them fear. Back at the big house, Sarah had gathered the rest of their group. It was time for Phase 2, the fire that would erase Thornfield Plantation from existence. Thomas the carpenter had mapped out exactly where they needed to set fires to ensure the big house burned completely. They moved through the building methodically, splashing lamp oil and kerosene on walls and floors and furniture, creating a network of accelerants that would turn the entire structure into an inferno. Sarah made one final trip to Cornelius's study, where his body still lay on the floor. She found the safe where he kept all the plantation's records, the bills of sale that claimed ownership of human beings, the financial ledgers that showed profit built on suffering. She opened the safe using the combination she had memorized months ago, and she pulled out every document inside. She spread them around the study, dousing them with kerosene, ensuring they would burn completely. When Thornfield burned, there would be no records left, no legal proof of ownership, nothing to tie any of them to this place. At exactly 10 o'clock, Sarah stood in the center of the big house with a lit torch in her hand. Around her, the other members of her group stood ready with their own torches. She looked at each of them, seeing the determination in their eyes, the years of pain that had led to this moment, the hope for freedom that sustained them. For everyone who ever suffered here, Sarah said, for every family torn apart, for every person who died in chains, for every child sold away from their mother, for Grace and her burned hand, for all of us, tonight we burn it down. Tonight we take back our freedom. She touched her torch to the kerosene-soaked floor, and flames erupted immediately, spreading with shocking speed. The others did the same throughout the house, setting fires in the kitchen, the parlor, the bedrooms, the study, the ballroom. Within minutes, the entire first floor was engulfed, flames racing up the stairs to the second and third floors, feeding on expensive furniture and silk curtains and polished wood floors, consuming everything. Sarah and her group fled the burning house, emerging into the night to find the entire enslaved community gathered in the yard, watching in shock and awe as the big house went up in flames. The fire grew rapidly, becoming a massive conflagration that lit up the night sky like a second sun. The heat was so intense that everyone had to back away, shielding their faces from the inferno. Sarah climbed onto a wagon and raised her voice so everyone could hear her over the roar of the flames. "Listen to me. Master Thornfield is dead. Mistress Thornfield is dead. Jeremiah Cobb is dead. The plantation records are burning. We are free. But we won't be free for long if we stay here. Neighboring plantations will see the fire. The militia will come. We have maybe an hour before this place is swarming with armed white men. So we have a choice. We can stay here and be captured, sold, probably killed, or we can run. We can head north. We can try for freedom. It's dangerous. Many of us might not make it, but I would rather die trying to be free than live one more day in chains." For a moment there was silence except for the crackling of the massive fire. Then Solomon stepped forward. "I'm going with Sarah," he announced. "Betty, children, we're going north. Anyone who wants to come, come now." One by one, then in groups, people began to step forward. Families gathered their children. Old people decided they would rather die on the road than in slavery. Young men and women who had dreamed of freedom but never thought it possible suddenly saw their chance. Out of 215 people at Thornfield Plantation, 197 chose to flee. Only 18, mostly elderly or ill people who couldn't survive the journey, chose to stay behind. Sarah felt a surge of emotion looking at the crowd of people who had chosen to follow her into the unknown. She had started this for revenge, for grace, for justice. But it had become something bigger, something more important. It had become a mass liberation, an exodus, a rejection of the entire system of slavery. Aunt Dinah appeared beside Sarah, Grace at her side, both of them ready to travel. The old woman's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Child, you done it. You actually done it. 200 souls marching to freedom. The ancestors are singing tonight." Sarah hugged the old woman, then her daughter, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She was leading these people into danger, but also toward hope. She would do everything in her power to get them to freedom. They moved quickly, gathering what supplies they could carry, forming into organized groups. Solomon took charge of the men who would serve as scouts and guards. Rose organized the women and children. Thomas, who knew the geography of the region, took the lead as navigator. Sarah coordinated everything, making decisions rapidly, keeping everyone moving. As they marched away from Thornfield Plantation, Sarah turned back one last time to look at the inferno consuming the big house. The flames were visible for miles, a beacon announcing the end of Cornelius Thornfield's reign of terror, a signal to every enslaved person in Mississippi that resistance was possible, that freedom could be taken by force. She thought about Cornelius convulsing on the floor, about Prudence's burned face, about Jeremiah's whipped back, and she felt no guilt. They had earned their deaths 1,000 times over. The journey north began under the harvest moon, nearly 200 people moving through the Mississippi night, heading for the river and the slim hope of freedom beyond it. They traveled mostly at night, hiding during the day in swamps and forests, following Aunt Dinah's network of safe houses, using the underground railroad paths that had helped countless others escape. The journey was brutal. They had little food, less water, and every sound could be pursuers. Children cried, old people struggled, injuries and illnesses threatened to slow them down, but they kept moving. Driven by the knowledge that capture meant death or a return to slavery that would be even worse than before. Sarah proved to be a natural leader, making hard decisions when necessary, distributing resources fairly, settling disputes, keeping morale up even when things looked hopeless. She consulted with Solomon, Aunt Dinah, and the other trusted members of her group, but ultimately the responsibility fell on her shoulders. She accepted it willingly. She had started this. She would see it through. On the third day after the fire, they reached the Mississippi River. Using their knowledge of waterways and with help from Underground Railroad contacts, they managed to steal several boats and rafts, enough to ferry the entire group across to the western bank. From there, they continued north through Arkansas and Missouri, always staying ahead of the slave catchers they knew were following. The pursuit was relentless. The burning of Thornfield Plantation and the mass escape had sent shockwaves through the entire region. Plantation owners throughout Mississippi, terrified that this rebellion would inspire others, had pooled resources to fund a massive manhunt. Bounty hunters and slave catchers with bloodhounds scoured the countryside, offering huge rewards for information. The local newspapers were full of stories about the Thornfield massacre, with wildly exaggerated accounts of the number dead and increasingly large rewards for Sarah's capture, dead or alive. But Sarah's group had advantages the hunters didn't expect. They had Aunt Dinah's knowledge of every safe house and sympathetic contact from Mississippi to Ohio. They had Solomon's physical strength and Isaac's courage to fight off patrols when necessary. They had Thomas's knowledge of the land. They had the desperate determination of people who knew that death was preferable to returning to slavery. And they had Sarah's brilliant tactical mind, always thinking 3 steps ahead, anticipating problems before they arose, finding solutions to seemingly impossible situations. Along the way, their numbers actually grew. They encountered other small groups of fugitive slaves and absorbed them into their exodus. By the time they reached southern Missouri, they numbered over 230 people, a small army of liberation moving north toward freedom. They helped each other survive, sharing food and water, carrying the weak, protecting the vulnerable, becoming a true community bound by shared struggle and shared hope. There were losses along the way. 3 elderly people died of exhaustion and illness, unable to survive the grueling pace. A young woman died in childbirth in the woods of Arkansas, though her baby survived, carried by others who promised to raise the child in freedom. 2 men were killed in a skirmish with a patrol of slave catchers in southern Missouri, sacrificing themselves so the others could escape. Each death was mourned, each person was remembered, but the group kept moving forward because stopping meant capture, and capture meant death or worse. After 6 weeks of continuous travel, covering over 800 miles of hostile territory, Sarah's group finally crossed the Ohio River into free territory. They waded across at night in Kentucky, their feet touching free soil for the first time, and the emotion was overwhelming. People fell to their knees, weeping, praising God, calling out the names of loved ones who hadn't made it, celebrating survival against impossible odds. Sarah stood on the northern bank of the Ohio River with Grace beside her, both of them exhausted but free, and she felt something break open in her chest. They had done it. Against all odds, they had done it. 193 of the original 197 who fled Thornfield had survived the journey. Plus the additional fugitives they had gathered along the way, their group now numbered 231 free people, the largest single successful mass escape in American slavery history. But freedom in the North came with its own challenges. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 meant that even in free states they were not truly safe. Slave catchers could still pursue them, could still legally reclaim them and drag them back to the South. So Sarah's group continued moving north, some settling in Ohio under assumed names, others pushing on to Michigan, still others crossing into Canada, where they would be truly beyond the reach of American slave laws. Sarah, Grace, Aunt Dinah, Solomon, and several others made it all the way to Canada, settling in a community of formerly enslaved people near Toronto. They found work, built new lives, created families. Grace's hand never fully healed, but she learned to adapt, eventually becoming a teacher, educating formerly enslaved children and adults, passing on the reading and writing skills her mother had taught her in secret. Sarah worked various jobs, always using her intelligence and determination to succeed, becoming a respected member of her community, a symbol of resistance and survival. News of the Thornfield Rebellion and the mass escape spread throughout the South like wildfire, carried by the slave grapevine, whispered in quarters late at night, sung in coded spirituals, passed from plantation to plantation. The story grew in the telling, becoming legend, becoming mythology, becoming a symbol of hope for enslaved people everywhere. Sarah's name became synonymous with resistance, whispered with reverence by some and hatred by others. For slaveholders throughout the South, the Thornfield Uprising was a nightmare come to life. It demonstrated that enslaved people were capable of sophisticated planning and execution, that they could successfully eliminate their oppressors and escape in large numbers. Paranoia swept through slave states. Masters began sleeping with loaded guns beside their beds. Laws regarding slavery were made even harsher in a desperate attempt to prevent similar uprisings. The number of overseers and patrols increased dramatically. Enslaved people faced even more restrictions, more surveillance, more violence. But the fear never went away. Every slaveholder understood that what happened at Thornfield could happen anywhere, that the person serving their food or working in their fields might be planning their death. The Thornfield uprising also energized the abolitionist movement in the North. Sarah's story was published in Frederick Douglass's newspaper and other abolitionist publications, held up as evidence of the inherent brutality of slavery and the natural human desire for freedom. Sarah herself became a speaker on the abolitionist circuit, traveling throughout the North and Canada, telling her story, showing her daughter's scarred hand, arguing that slavery could only be ended through its complete abolition. She worked alongside other famous formerly enslaved activists like Harriet Tubman and William Wells Brown, contributing to the growing momentum that would eventually lead to the Civil War and emancipation. The legal aftermath of the Thornfield burning was complicated because the plantation records had been completely destroyed in the fire, and because the main witnesses, Cornelius, Prudence, and Jeremiah, were dead. It became impossible to prove legal ownership of most of the people who had escaped. This created a precedent that abolitionists seized upon, arguing that without documentation, slavery claims were invalid. The Thornfield case was cited in several court cases challenging the Fugitive Slave Act. In Mississippi, the Thornfield property was eventually sold to pay debts, divided and distributed among multiple buyers. The land where the big house once stood remained empty for years, locals considering it cursed, haunted by the ghosts of the Thornfield family. Some enslaved people who had stayed behind because they were too old or ill to flee were eventually freed or allowed to remain on the land as paid laborers, a highly unusual arrangement for the time. The entire region remained on edge for years after the uprising, every unexplained fire or death of a white person blamed on potential rebels inspired by Sarah's example. Historically, the Thornfield uprising is now recognized as one of the most significant acts of slave resistance in American history, comparable to Nat Turner's rebellion, but with a much higher success rate in terms of people who achieved freedom. Modern historians estimate that between 250 and 300 people ultimately gained their freedom as a direct result of Sarah's actions, counting not just the original escapees, but also people who were inspired by the story to make their own escape attempts in the months following. Sarah lived to see the end of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. She was 53 years old when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, and she wept upon hearing the news, knowing that 4 million people were being freed, that the system she had fought against with fire and blood was finally being destroyed. She lived until 1897, dying at age 74, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who lived in freedom because of her courage. Grace lived an even longer life, making it to 1907, becoming a powerful voice for education and civil rights, working to help formerly enslaved people adjust to freedom, advocating for voting rights and economic justice. She always kept her scarred right hand visible, never hiding it, using it as a teaching tool to show young people what slavery had been like, to ensure that no one forgot the brutality of the system their ancestors had endured. Solomon lived until 1878, working as a blacksmith in Canada and becoming a prosperous business owner, employing other formerly enslaved people, building a life of dignity that would have been impossible in Mississippi. He and Betty had 4 more children in freedom, all of whom received education and opportunities they never could have had in slavery. Aunt Dinah survived the journey north despite her advanced age, living another 5 years in freedom before dying peacefully in her sleep in 1862 at approximately 79 years old. Her knowledge of hoodoo and healing herbs was passed down to several students, including Sarah, preserving African-American spiritual traditions that might otherwise have been lost. The 18 still enslaved people who remained at Thornfield after the fire faced harsh consequences initially, interrogated brutally by authorities trying to understand what had happened. But most were eventually sold to other plantations or freed when their new owners died, surviving to see emancipation in 1865. Today, the site of Thornfield Plantation is a historical landmark, one of the few slavery sites in Mississippi that openly acknowledges resistance rather than romanticizing the antebellum South. The foundation of the big house is still visible, overgrown with vegetation, a memorial to the night Sarah burned it to the ground. A museum on the site tells the story of the uprising, displays artifacts recovered from the ruins, and honors the 231 people who achieved freedom through one of the most audacious acts of resistance in American history. Sarah's story raises profound questions about justice, violence, and resistance that remain relevant today. Was what she did murder or self-defense? Was the burning of Thornfield terrorism or revolution? When legal systems provide no protection and no recourse, when oppression is total and sanctioned by law, what options remain for the oppressed? These questions have no easy answers, but Sarah's story forces us to confront them honestly. What we can say with certainty is that Sarah refused to accept the role of victim. She refused to allow her daughter to suffer without consequence. She refused to let the system that enslaved her maintain its power unchallenged. She took enormous risks, made terrible sacrifices, crossed moral lines that we can debate but never fully understand, because we have never faced the totality of oppression that she endured. She did what she believed was necessary for survival and liberation, and in doing so, she freed 231 people who would otherwise have died in slavery. The legacy of Thornfield extends far beyond the immediate participants. The uprising inspired dozens of other smaller rebellions and escape attempts throughout the South in the years before the Civil War. It provided proof that mass resistance was possible, that enslaved people could defeat their oppressors, that freedom could be taken rather than granted. It contributed to the growing national crisis over slavery that would eventually explode into the Civil War, helping to make abolition not just a moral cause, but a political necessity. For descendants of enslaved people, Sarah's story is a reminder that their ancestors were not passive victims, but active resistors who fought for freedom in countless ways, from subtle acts of everyday resistance to dramatic uprisings like Thornfield. For descendants of slaveholders, it is a reminder that the wealth and privilege inherited from the past came at a terrible human cost, paid in blood and suffering by people who never stopped fighting for their humanity. For all Americans, the Thornfield Uprising is a reminder that our nation was built on fundamental contradictions, claiming to be the land of the free while enslaving millions, preaching equality while practicing oppression. The violence of slavery inevitably generated resistance, and that resistance was as much a part of American history as anything celebrated in textbooks. Sarah's story forces us to acknowledge the full reality of our past, both the horrors of slavery and the courage of those who fought against it. The fire that consumed Thornfield Plantation on September 15, 1857, burned for 3 days, visible for miles around, a beacon of resistance in the heart of the Deep South. The ashes of the big house mingled with the rich Mississippi soil, built on the backs of enslaved labor. The smoke rose into the autumn sky, carrying with it the end of Cornelius Thornfield's reign of terror and the beginning of 231 journeys to freedom. That fire never truly went out. It continues to burn in the memory of everyone who learns Sarah's story, a reminder that the human spirit cannot be permanently enslaved, that resistance is always possible, that freedom is worth fighting for no matter the cost. If you feel anger after hearing this story, you should. These events really happened. If you feel inspired, remember that Sarah's fight continues in different forms today. Systemic oppression still exists, still damages lives, still demands resistance. What will you do with Sarah's legacy? Will you remember? Will you educate others? Will you fight for justice in your own time? The choice, unlike for Sarah and those who lived in slavery, is yours to make freely. Use that freedom wisely. Honor their struggle by never taking your own freedom for granted. And never, ever forget that ordinary people, when pushed beyond endurance, are capable of extraordinary acts of resistance that change the course of history. Sarah of Mississippi was one such person, and her fire still burns.